January 1945. Western Pacific. Before dawn. The engines start in the dark, one by one. Radial cylinders coughing into rhythm. Propellers cutting cold air on a coral airstrip worn thin by years of war. Japanese pilots climb into their cockpits expecting resistance. They have flown this route before. They know the timing. They know when enemy fighters should rise to meet them. At altitude, the sky opens wide. Cloud layers drift slowly beneath their wings. Sunlight breaks across the canopy glass. The radios remain quiet. No contrails. No distant engine noise. No flashes of interception. The formation presses on, scanning every direction. Hands tighten on control sticks. Eyes move from horizon to instruments and back again. The silence stretches longer than it should. This is not relief. It is confusion. For years, Allied aircraft had come relentlessly, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes filling the sky. Now, nothing rises to challenge them. No warning, no explanation. The pilots had trained for combat. They had prepared for loss, but not for absence. As the minutes pass, a realization begins to form quietly, uneasily, that this silence is not accidental. It is the result of forces already set in motion far beyond the sky. The war before the silence. January 1945. The Pacific War had entered its final, irreversible phase. What had begun in December 1941 as a lightning campaign of surprise and expansion had become a prolonged struggle of attrition. One Japan could no longer sustain. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces had once dominated the skies over Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Their pilots were among the most experienced in the world. Their aircraft, especially the Mitsubishi A6M0, had redefined air combat in the early years of the war. But those advantages had been eroding for more than 2 years. After the battles of Midway in June 1942 and Guadalcanal later that year, Japan began losing not just aircraft, but irreplaceable human capital. Veteran pilots, trained through years of rigorous pre-war programs, were shot down or lost at sea. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked a deep, scalable pilot training pipeline. Each loss weighed heavier than the last. By 1943, Allied production had begun to overwhelm Japanese industry. American factories produced aircraft in numbers Japan could not approach. New Allied fighters, faster, more heavily armed, and better protected, entered service in growing quantities. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair gradually neutralized the Zero's early advantages, especially when flown by well-trained pilots using coordinated tactics. Japanese air doctrine, however, remained rooted in earlier assumptions. It emphasized defensive spirit, close-range maneuver combat, and individual skill. These principles had worked when Japan faced smaller, less experienced opponents. Against an enemy with radar, mass production, and growing numerical superiority, they became liabilities. Still, Japanese planners expected resistance. Throughout 1944, Allied air activity had been constant. Long-range bombers appeared with increasing frequency. Carrier task forces struck island after island, neutralizing airfields before ground forces even landed. Japanese pilots grew accustomed to scrambling under pressure, sometimes with only minutes of warning, to intercept overwhelming formations. By late 1944, many Japanese air units were operating with skeleton crews. Fuel shortages limited training hours. Replacement pilots often arrived with only basic flight experience. Aircraft were kept flying through improvisation and cannibalization, not steady supply. Yet the expectation of combat remained ingrained. Air operations were planned under the assumption that Allied fighters would appear. If not immediately, then soon. Interception had become routine. The sky, once contested, was now assumed to be hostile by default. That is why the silence encountered by Japanese pilots in early 1945 was so deeply unsettling. It violated everything their experience had taught them about the war's rhythm. What they did not yet fully grasp was that the absence of enemy aircraft was not a temporary gap. It was the visible symptom of a strategic shift already complete. And as Japanese formations climbed higher, believing they were flying into danger, the reality forming beneath them was far more devastating than any dogfight. Why the sky went quiet. Silence encountered by Japanese pilots in early 1945 did not come from Allied weakness. It came from Allied control. By this stage of the war, the United States and its allies no longer needed to contest every stretch of sky. They chose when and where to fight, and just as importantly, when not to. Air power had evolved from reactive defense into deliberate dominance. Allied radar networks now covered vast areas of the Pacific. Early warning stations, integrated command centers, and carrier-based detection allowed American commanders to see Japanese aircraft long before they approached critical targets. Interception was no longer rushed or improvised. It was calculated just as decisive was logistics. By late 1944, Japan's fuel situation had become catastrophic. The loss of oil fields in the Dutch East Indies and the relentless Allied submarine campaign against Japanese shipping meant aviation fuel was rationed severely. Many air units were allocated only enough fuel for operational missions, not training. Some pilots went into combat having flown only a handful of hours on their assigned aircraft. Allied pilots, by contrast, trained extensively. They rotated out of combat, learned from previous engagements, and returned with improved tactics. Losses were replaced quickly. Aircraft were upgraded continuously. This imbalance reshaped the sky. In earlier phases of the war, Japanese air activity triggered immediate Allied response. By 1945, Allied commanders often withheld interception deliberately. Reconnaissance aircraft tracked Japanese movements while fighters remained grounded or at altitude elsewhere. The objective was not to engage every enemy plane but to conserve strength for decisive moments. Japanese early warning systems, already degraded by bombing and island losses, struggled to interpret this change. Radar coverage was incomplete. Communication lines were fragile. Air raid alerts often arrived late or not at all. When Japanese pilots climbed into the air expecting contact, the absence of opposition felt unnatural. They scanned the sky for signs that never appeared. The radio remained silent not because Allied pilots were unaware but because they were watching, waiting, and choosing restraint. This was a new kind of warfare. The sky was no longer a shared battlefield. It had become a controlled environment. One side flew within it. The other merely passed through. For Japanese aircrews, trained to measure danger by visible threat, this shift was profoundly destabilizing. Silence provided no feedback. No enemy meant no validation of effort, no clear objective, no confirmation that the mission still mattered. What they did not yet know was that Allied air superiority had reached a point where interception was optional. The decisive battles were being prepared elsewhere over targets Japan could no longer protect. And as Japanese aircraft continued their mission, the meaning of the empty sky began to change from confusion to something far more ominous. For Japanese pilots, the sky had always been a place of confrontation from the first days of the war. Flight meant engagement to either hunting the enemy or being hunted. Even ferry flights carried tension. Even training missions carried the weight of what awaited beyond them. The cockpit was a space conditioned for threat. In early 1945, that conditioning worked against them. Pilots scanned the horizon continuously, expecting distant specks to resolve into enemy fighters. They adjusted altitude, tightened formation spacing, and conserved ammunition, preparing for contact that never came. Minutes stretched longer than planned. Fuel gauges ticked downward without purpose. The absence of combat created a different kind of pressure. Some pilots later described the sensation as being watched without seeing the watcher. Others noted how their attention turned inward toward mechanical sounds, engine vibration, the hum of airflow because there was nothing external to engage. Anxiety replaced adrenaline. The silence also erased the pilot's role. Combat had meaning. It confirmed purpose. Without it, the mission felt hollow. There was no test of skill, no enemy to measure oneself against, only unanswered questions. For aircrews already strained by losses and fatigue, the psychological void was destabilizing. It suggested that the enemy no longer considered them a priority. That realization, once formed, was difficult to ignore, and it carried implications far beyond a single flight. By 1945, the technological balance in the air had shifted decisively. Allied aircraft were faster, better armed, and more durable. Radar-guided interception allowed fighters to be vectored precisely, eliminating the need for constant patrols. Carrier-based aviation extended coverage hundreds of miles beyond fleet formations. Japanese aircraft, many designed earlier in the war, lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Maintenance became increasingly difficult as spare parts disappeared. Even when planes were available, fuel often was not. This disparity meant that Allied commanders no longer needed to contest airspace continuously. They could afford to wait. They could afford to choose. Japanese pilots flying into empty skies were not witnessing Allied absence. They were experiencing Allied confidence. The technology had made presence optional. In war, silence can be deliberate. Allied air doctrine had evolved to prioritize mission outcome over engagement count. Fighters were increasingly reserved to protect bombers, fleets, or critical infrastructure. Intercepting every Japanese sortie was unnecessary. For Japanese commanders, trained to read threat through engagement, this restraint was misinterpreted. Silence was assumed to be weakness, delay, or error. In reality, it was control. The lack of interception was not a gap in defense. It was a tactical message, one the Japanese would only fully understand later. Because when the sky offers no resistance, it often means the battle has already been decided elsewhere. And that realization leads directly into the deeper forces shaping this moment. By late 1944, Japanese high command faced an increasingly distorted picture of the war. Reports from the field were often delayed, incomplete, or filtered to preserve morale. Losses were underreported. Operational failures were reframed as temporary setbacks. The scale of Allied production and training capacity was understood in theory, but its consequences were not fully absorbed. This disconnect shaped expectations. Commanders continued to plan air operations assuming that the enemy would respond, as they had before, with immediate interception, heavy opposition, and visible resistance. When that resistance failed to appear, there was no framework to interpret it correctly. Silence was not seen as dominance. It was seen as mystery. Some leaders believed Allied forces were regrouping. Others assumed resources had been diverted elsewhere. Very few recognized that the absence of response meant Japanese aircraft were no longer worth contesting at that moment. This misreading delayed adaptation. Instead of reassessing strategy, many units pressed forward as planned, flying into increasingly irrelevant missions while decisive actions unfolded beyond their reach. From the Allied side, the empty sky represented efficiency. By early 1945, Allied air forces operated with near-total situational awareness. Reconnaissance tracked Japanese air movements without engaging. Signals intelligence intercepted communications. Commanders knew when Japanese aircraft were airborne and where they were headed. Choosing not to intercept was sometimes the optimal decision. Fighters conserved fuel. Pilots rested. Aircraft remained available for critical strikes. The goal was no longer to prove superiority but to apply it precisely. To Japanese pilots, this restraint was invisible. They could not see the radar screens, the command rooms, or the calculations behind the silence. They experienced only the result. An uncontested sky. Combat validates sacrifice. Silence undermines it. For pilots trained to accept death as part of duty, the lack of engagement introduced a different kind of doubt. If the enemy did not rise to meet them, what did that say about the mission? About the war? Some pilots later reflected that the silence felt like exclusion from relevance, from impact, from history itself. The war was continuing, but not around them. This moral dislocation was subtle, but corrosive. It eroded confidence not through defeat, but through neglect. And as Japanese aircraft continued to fly missions into skies that no longer answered back, the meaning of that silence edged closer to revelation. Because soon, the reason for it would become unmistakably clear. When the meaning of silence became clear, the realization did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments. In January 1945, Japanese air operations continued across multiple fronts, from the Philippines to Formosa, from the South China Sea to the approaches of Okinawa. Missions were launched under assumptions that no longer matched reality. Pilots took off expecting interception. Commanders planned responses that never materialized. Then patterns began to emerge. Japanese aircraft reached targets without opposition, only to find those targets already devastated. Airfields were cratered. Facilities were abandoned. Harbors lay silent, not from concealment, but from destruction. The enemy had moved on. Reports filtered back slowly, unevenly confirming that Allied carrier groups were operating beyond previous limits. Bombers were striking with precision and withdrawing without pursuit. Interceptions occurred only when Allied objectives were directly threatened. The decisive moment came as Japanese pilots realized they were flying after the war's center of gravity, not toward it. On some missions, crews searched desperately for enemy aircraft, believing the absence signaled an ambush. They widened their patrol arcs. They burned fuel they could not replace. Still, nothing appeared. The sky remained empty. This was not temporary. It was systemic. Allied air power had reached a point where it no longer needed to react to Japanese initiative. Initiative itself had shifted. Japanese pilots, trained to read the battle through contact, now faced a battlefield defined by omission. Each uneventful sortie confirmed the same truth. The enemy was choosing silence. And silence, when chosen, is a weapon. As this understanding began to spread through squadrons and command posts, its implications became impossible to ignore. The absence of Allied fighters was not sparing Japan. It was bypassing it. The war was moving toward a conclusion that Japanese air power could no longer influence. And that realization set the stage for the moment when silence would give way not to combat but to finality. The moment the sky no longer mattered. Early 1945. The truth became unavoidable. Japanese air units were no longer shaping the course of the war. They were reacting to outcomes already decided by forces beyond their reach: industrial capacity, logistics, intelligence, and sustained air superiority. The sky, once the arena where Japan had seized momentum, had become a corridor through which its remaining strength quietly drained away. The decisive shift was not marked by a single battle, but by a realization shared across units. There was nothing left to intercept, and no one left to stop. Allied carrier task forces moved freely across the Pacific. Strategic bombers struck from high altitude with minimal opposition. Airfields that once launched interceptors now launch only isolated sorties, unable to influence the tempo or direction of operations. For Japanese pilots, this was the true turning point, landing after uneventful missions. They found ground crews struggling to keep aircraft operational. Fuel reserves were counted in days, sometimes hours. Replacement parts were scavenged from wrecks. Training schedules were abandoned altogether. Commanders issued orders that grew increasingly detached from reality. Missions were flown more out of obligation than strategy. The sky, vast and empty, no longer offered a path to reversal. This was not defeat in the traditional sense. There were no mass dogfights to mark the end, no climactic engagement to signal final loss of control. Instead, defeat arrived as irrelevance. The silence that had first shocked Japanese pilots now defined their existence. They flew, they landed, and nothing changed. The war moved forward without them. And when Allied forces turned their full attention toward Japan itself, toward the home islands, the meaning of that silence became absolute. Air power had passed beyond contest. What remained was consequence. The effects of the silent sky unfolded rapidly and relentlessly. By the spring of 1945, Allied air power operated with near total freedom across the Western Pacific. Japanese air resistance, once a defining feature of the conflict, had been reduced to sporadic, localized efforts incapable of altering outcomes. The strategic balance was no longer in question. Allied carrier strikes intensified. Airfields across the Philippines, Formosa, and the Ryukyu Islands were neutralized methodically. Runways were cratered. Hangars were destroyed. Aircraft were eliminated on the ground faster than they could be replaced. Japanese aircraft losses accelerated not in air combat, but through attrition. Planes were destroyed before takeoff or abandoned due to lack of fuel. Pilots survived missions only to discover there was nowhere left to operate from. The psychological impact was profound. Units that had once measured success and victories now measured survival and uneventful landings. Morale eroded as the realization spread that skill and courage could no longer compensate for structural collapse. Allied reports from this period emphasize efficiency rather than drama. Missions were executed with minimal resistance. Losses were low. Objectives were achieved according to schedule. The absence of enemy fighters was noted not with surprise, but with expectation. For Japanese leadership, the consequences were grim but unavoidable. Strategic options narrowed. Air defense of the home islands became increasingly symbolic rather than effective. Resources were diverted toward desperate measures, including last resort tactics that reflected the absence of viable alternatives. The silence in the sky had transformed from an anomaly into a constant condition. The absence of aerial opposition was no longer remarkable. It was routine, and in that routine lay the final message of the silent sky. The war had reached a point where resistance no longer defined its outcome. Only its consequences did. What does silent sky mean in war? Victory is often imagined as noise. Engines roaring, guns firing, aircraft falling from the sky. But the end of Japan's air war came quietly. The silent sky encountered by Japanese pilots in 1945 was not an accident of weather or timing. It was the result of systems overwhelming individuals, industry surpassing courage, logistics outlasting sacrifice, information defeating intuition. Air power had evolved beyond the duel. It had become an environment controlled by those who could see farther, build faster, and sustain longer. For the pilots who flew into that emptiness, the silence carried a unique weight. It stripped away the clarity of combat and replaced it with uncertainty. It offered no enemy to confront, no moment of decision, only the knowledge that the war no longer revolved around them. History often remembers the dramatic final acts, the last battles, the last orders, the last flights. Yet the true end sometimes arrives earlier, in moments that feel uneventful at the time. When the sky stays silent, it does not mean the danger has passed. It means control has been decided. The Japanese pilots who searched the horizon and found nothing were witnessing that decision, made real over their heads, beyond their reach, and without spectacle. In that silence lay the final lesson of air power in the Second World War. When one side no longer needs to fight for the sky, the war has already entered its final chapter.